An arraignment is set for murder suspect Luigi Mangione. Right now, he's facing an 11-count indictment for murder and terrorism in the death of UnitedHealthcare CEO Brian Thompson.
UnitedHealthcare CEO's shooting suspect Luigi Mangione is expected to be arraigned on state charges in New York tomorrow.
Luigi Mangione's life seemed like the perfect blueprint for success. Born into a family sitting at the pinnacle of wealth, among the top 1% of the elite, his path was paved with privilege and endless opportunities. From the hallowed halls of a prestigious prep school in Maryland to earning both undergraduate and postgraduate degrees from the Ivy League's renowned Penn, Mangione embodied the American dream. By the age of 26, he appeared to have it all: education, influence, and a future bursting with promise. Yet behind this golden facade lay a darkness no one could have predicted. But today, he sits in a jail cell, facing charges that could put him behind bars for the rest of his life. He is accused of the cold-blooded assassination of Brian Thompson, the CEO of UnitedHealthcare, in broad daylight on the streets of New York City. What started as a murder investigation has since spiraled into something far more complex. Mangione now faces terrorism charges, and the federal government has stepped in, filing additional charges that reveal a chilling level of premeditation and intent. This case has become one of the most talked about crime stories in recent memory, not only because of the shocking nature of the crime, but also because of the surprising public response. Despite the gravity of the charges, Mangione has garnered an unusual amount of support online, with some hailing him as a kind of anti-hero. They argue that his actions were not those of a criminal, but of a man taking a stand against systemic corruption in the healthcare industry. It's a claim that adds layers of complexity to an already controversial case. In court today, Mangione appeared markedly different from his earlier appearances. Gone was the chaotic defiance he displayed when first arrested. Instead, he was calm and composed, eerily so. Observers noted that he even smiled at times while speaking with his attorney. This shift in demeanor has raised questions. Has Mangione come to terms with his fate, or is this part of a larger strategy to sway public opinion and the jury? The federal complaint unsealed today sheds new light on Mangione's motives and planning. Investigators discovered a notebook in his possession, its pages filled with detailed entries about the health insurance industry and his disdain for wealthy executives. One entry, dated August 15th, outlines his belief that insurance companies were the perfect target, a sentiment that would later translate into a meticulously planned attack. In another chilling entry from October, Mangione referenced an investor conference as a true windfall and detailed plans to whack the CEO of one of the companies attending. The timeline aligns disturbingly well with the events leading up to Thompson's murder. These writings paint a picture of a man who saw himself not as a criminal, but as a revolutionary, a perception that seems to resonate with his growing base of supporters. Then there's the murder weapon, a 3D printed gun equipped with a suppressor. This wasn't a weapon purchased off the streets. It was one painstakingly crafted with precision and purpose. Mangione's possession of the gun, along with other damning evidence such as fingerprints, DNA, and surveillance footage, leaves little room for doubt about his role in the crime. Yet what puzzles many is Mangione's behavior after the murder. Most would expect a killer to flee as far as possible, but Mangione stayed remarkably close, ultimately being apprehended 5 days later in Pennsylvania. He was found sitting in a McDonald's, seemingly unbothered by the nationwide manhunt. Was this a sign of arrogance, a belief in the righteousness of his actions, or simply a calculated surrender? The federal charges against Mangione hinge on his interstate movements and his use of electronic devices to plan the crime. Prosecutors argue that his travel from Georgia to New York and his reliance on a cell phone and the internet to coordinate the attack qualify this as a federal case. But critics have questioned whether the federal government's involvement is an overreach. After all, murder is typically prosecuted at the state level, and New York's legal system seemed more than capable of handling the case. Legal experts are divided on the federal government's decision to intervene. Some see it as a necessary step to ensure justice, given the nature of the crime and the high-profile victim. Others argue that the added charges complicate what should be a straightforward prosecution and risk making Mangione appear as a martyr to his supporters. And that's perhaps the most troubling aspect of this case: the way public opinion is shaping the narrative. On social media, hashtags supporting Mangione have trended, and videos dissecting his supposed message have garnered millions of views. While some argue that his actions shine a light on systemic flaws in the healthcare industry, others warn that glorifying such violence sets a dangerous precedent. For Brian Thompson's family, however, the focus remains on justice. They have called for the maximum penalty, arguing that anything less than life without parole would be an insult to the memory of a man who dedicated his life to leading one of the country's largest healthcare companies. Yet with Mangione's growing cult-like following, there is a real concern that the trial could be swayed by public sentiment and the potential for jury nullification. Jury nullification. The concept of a jury acquitting a defendant despite clear evidence of guilt has become a buzzword in discussions about the case. Mangione's defense team seems poised to capitalize on the polarization surrounding the healthcare industry, presenting their client not as a murderer, but as a man driven to desperate actions by a corrupt system. It's a strategy that has worked in the past in cases where public opinion played a significant role, and it's one that could complicate the path to justice for Thompson's family. As the legal battle unfolds, questions abound. Was this an act of terrorism, as prosecutors allege, or a misguided attempt at activism? Can Mangione receive a fair trial in the age of social media, where opinions are formed and amplified at lightning speed? And most importantly, will Brian Thompson's family ever see true justice for their loss? This is just the beginning of what promises to be a long and contentious trial. The evidence is damning, but the court of public opinion has already complicated matters. Mangione's supporters argue that his actions were a form of protest, while his detractors see him as a cold-blooded killer who must be held accountable. The story of Luigi Mangione doesn't just end in the courtroom, it echoes in the streets, on social media platforms, and even in the nation's psyche. What began as the tragic assassination of UnitedHealthcare CEO Brian Thompson has now transformed into a polarizing cultural phenomenon. The case has sparked debates about justice, wealth inequality, and the ethics of corporate America. But beneath the surface, it also raises critical questions about the role of public opinion in determining guilt, punishment, and legacy. As the trial looms, Mangione's growing online following has become impossible to ignore. Supporters of his actions argue that he represents a voice of resistance against a system that prioritizes profits over people. They highlight the healthcare industry's widely criticized practices, denials of coverage, skyrocketing premiums, and billion-dollar executive bonuses. In their view, Mangione's crime, though violent, exposes a deeper rot within the system. This narrative has gained traction among younger demographics, as shown by polls. Shockingly, 41% of respondents aged 18 to 29 found Mangione's actions at least somewhat acceptable. Such numbers are unprecedented and deeply troubling, particularly for prosecutors who must select jurors from a pool influenced by these sentiments. If nearly half of young people view Mangione's act as justified, it raises real concerns about the likelihood of a unanimous conviction. The cultural response to Mangione's crime has extended beyond opinions, its influencing consumer behavior and trends. The jacket he was wearing during the attack has sold out online, becoming an unlikely fashion statement. A book associated with his writings has surged to the top of bestseller lists. These bizarre developments reveal the unsettling ways in which tragedy and crime can be commodified in the digital age. Despite this wave of public fascination, the families and loved ones of Brian Thompson are left grappling with an unimaginable loss. Thompson was not just a corporate executive. He was a father, husband, and community leader. For them, the trial isn't about political messages or systemic critiques. It's about accountability and justice for a life taken too soon. Mangione's defense team has been quick to capitalize on the cultural undercurrents surrounding the case. They've framed him as a martyr, a man driven to desperate measures by a corrupt system. But they face an uphill battle, as prosecutors are armed with overwhelming evidence, including Mangione's notebooks, surveillance footage, and the murder weapon. The defense's most likely path is to appeal to the jury's emotions, arguing that Mangione's actions were the result of systemic pressures rather than pure malice. The federal charges have added another layer of complexity to the trial. While the federal government's involvement might seem logical given the interstate elements of the case, critics argue that it risks making Mangione appear as a political prisoner rather than a criminal. Federal prosecutors have also introduced the possibility of the death penalty, a controversial move that could further polarize public opinion. This dual-pronged prosecution, state and federal, has fueled debates about the fairness of the justice system. Why, some ask, is so much effort being poured into this case when countless other victims' families receive no such attention? For others, the involvement of both jurisdictions is a necessary step to ensure that justice is served in such a high-profile crime. In the courtroom, jury selection will be a battlefield. Prosecutors will aim to exclude younger, tech-savvy individuals who might sympathize with Mangione's motives. Meanwhile, the defense will seek jurors who are critical of corporate America or skeptical of law enforcement. This tug-of-war over who gets to decide Mangione's fate will be crucial in shaping the outcome of the trial. As the legal proceedings begin, the public's fascination with the case continues to grow. Documentaries, podcasts, and countless think pieces have emerged, each dissecting the crime from different angles. Some focus on the ethical implications of Mangione's actions, while others delve into the psychological profile of a man who turned his privilege into a weapon. But while the nation debates, one question remains unanswered. What drove Mangione to commit such an act? Was it a deeply held belief in the need for systemic change, or was it the actions of a man consumed by personal vendettas and a skewed sense of justice? His notebooks offer some clues, but they also raise more questions than answers. Regardless of his motives, one truth is clear: Mangione's actions have left a permanent scar. Brian Thompson's murder has devastated a family, shocked a city, and sparked a nationwide conversation. And as the trial progresses, the spotlight will remain on the man who upended so many lives in pursuit of his twisted mission. The trial of Luigi Mangione is more than just a legal proceeding. It's a mirror reflecting the fractured state of our society. It forces us to confront difficult questions about justice, morality, and the limits of protest. But as we debate these issues, let's not forget the true heart of this case: a life lost and a family left to grieve. Justice, in its purest form, isn't about headlines or hashtags. It's about accountability and closure for those who've suffered. As we follow this story, let's strive to remember that behind every statistic and soundbite are real people with real pain. If you found this deep dive into the case insightful, don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned.